Great, great. Yeah. All right. Well, we will definitely come back to that, and that perfectly brings up Karuna's work, the important work on Maine and on questions of imperialism. Karuna, if you'd like to join us and present.
Thank you. Thank you. Of course, it's an incredible honor to be part of this conversation. I have already learned so much. So what I'm going to do is just say a few things, maybe remind us about a couple of broad arguments about abolition of property that were prominent in the 19th century, especially in the early 20th century. And I especially want to, in a way, note the differences and different resonances within a Marxist understanding of abolition of property and an anarchist understanding. And I partially want to give a little bit of a shout out to our poor anarchists who are really the center of this question. And I follow my old colleague, Jim Scott, two cheers for anarchism, to see how much of that language is still with us as well. So again, I'm hopefully going to try to highlight what I think to be maybe important legacies and controversies between the Marxist and anarchist interpretation of what abolition requires and is capable of. So I'm just going to try to make a couple of points. One, I think, why abolish property? I think one is understanding the abolition of property as an institution. So this, I think we've talked of, for Marx and the Marxists, private property is understood as a system of exploitation, of structural inequality, of unfreedom. And it's linked to, of course, to industrial capitalism, a mode of production built on the exploitation and commodification of so-called free labor. Its abolition or overcoming the system of property might imply, on the one hand, a communalization of the mode of production, of capital possibly, the collective and conscious democratic organization of production, a democratic state, in Marx's language, the free association of all for all. So here I think we take property and the exploitative nature of property to be a symptom of a particular political organization of production coming out of a mode of production. The anarchists, and this is of course a very broad group, Proudhon is one, but Proudhon and Bakunin are probably the ones that are closest to Marx in some way. But I also would like, and I will eventually think of ones who are further away, but still like the Marxists, like Tolstoy, Kropotkin, also really did agree with the Marxists that the institution of private property, was deeply unequal, was exploitative, coercive. They had a structural critique of the division of labor. But I think for them, what was even more maybe different is that they linked the problem of property to a series of cognate institutions, law, prisons, armies, and especially maybe most significant difference, ultimately the problem of the state itself. So abolition of property was for them a part and parcel of the broader project of the abolition of the state. And that there, I think then their central worry in a way, maybe not directly exploitation, but coercion and violence. So property and laws regulating property, taxes, et cetera, were understood as monopolized by elites, the state as a protection racket. This was Tolstoy's favorite line. The state is a concentration of power. It cannot be democratized in the way that socialists and Marxists may hope for. And so we should always be wary of the institution of the state as corrupting in some form. So in the anarchist tradition, I think, again, in some way, I think they're the first, I think, but maybe we can find older, along with the abolitionists, who really did think about what it would mean to live without standing armies, what it would mean to live without prisons, what it would mean to live without the death penalty, without, they were a broad standing debate about the nature of violence in modern societies. And so again, I'm someone now very interested in the history of nonviolence, so I run into and read a lot of these interesting critics. And the Tolstoyan movement, especially, this was a combined vegetarians who were critical of the industrial slaughter of animals as part of the same complex of a coercive industrial division of labor. So I think there is something there that I want to just remind us and see what we can learn from that side of it too. So here, just to make the contrast, maybe again, the Marxist, property is a symptom of exploitation or economic production or a political order of economic production. whereas for the anarchist, property is a symptom of a coercive and centralized state system, or an institution of the modern state, a system of power. So I think in some ways for our contemporary discussions, this sort of conflict or conversation comes out, especially in the most recent discussion in this seminar on abolition of police. You see, and prisons too, you see a kind of debate between whether the state is going to be an enabling condition for the abolition of prisons as well as property, or for the reform of police, or whether we have to turn away from the state and think about community organizing or self-organizing that doesn't get, that might be democratic, it might be different, but it might be some way in which we have to decide if we're going to opt in or out of the state, or we're going to reform the state or do this outside. I think the traditional Marxist language has always been to privilege the state and the larger unit as the mode of reform, of radical transformation. But I think there might be good reasons to recover the anarchist anxiety about the state as the agency of transformation. I think for us today, I mean, I'm quite taken by both these arguments. So I think for me, the question might be, instead of thinking them of as either or, as they always have been in the past, to think more of a both and. So maybe there's something both about a dual track of what you do via the state and what you also can do outside of the state in some form. Okay, so the other point I want to bring up is why abolish property as an idea, as a theory or a philosophy. And here I think one of the things that I've always found so striking about Marx, and I bring this up, I think I partially asked Bernard to include the critique of the Gotha program, because here I think there's also, of course, Marx's critique of private property as an institution, but I think what's really powerful is also Marx's critique of the moral theory that underpins ideas of property or of bourgeois right. And so here I think property is closely connected to an ideology or theory of just desert or merit. And this, I think, is something we associate with liberal ideology, with individualism. And I think something that is deeply ingrained, especially in American political life. Everyone has noted the idea from Tocqueville to Du Bois. Du Bois called it the American assumption, a kind of individualism that believes that property is something that is ours through our effort. And we know that this is something that really deeply inflects debates about welfare, debates about the care we other citizens deserve. And I think the problem is we still do really think in a language of just desert and merit. And I think Marx is one of the most powerful critics of that idea. And in the Gotha program, you know, as you know, the Gotha program is a critique of a program of state transformation, equivalent to the Communist Manifesto put together by the Social Democratic or United Workers' Party in Germany in 1875. And Marx, I'm just going to follow, he goes piece by piece through the program and criticizes it, of course. But the one piece that he criticizes, I think, in a very interesting way, is saying, you know, what the Gotha program says, what we want is a fair distribution of the proceeds of labor. And Marx goes in to criticize the question of what do we mean by fair or equal distribution. He sort of says, how do we even think of it? What would be fair? I'll just quote a little. He said, one man is superior to another physically or mentally, or supplies more labor, can labor longer. And he said someone might be married, have 3 kids. So what would be a fair distribution when they're so unequal in our capacities in some way? And he said, in a way, to show that actually the question shouldn't be about fairness as such, or the ideology of desert. And it's not about who deserves more because of the energy or mind, or even if we try to get into that and give a more egalitarian idea of just desert, he thinks in the end, it's always going to lead us into problems. So what we should really do, of course, is try to sever the connection between earning and appropriation from one's productive powers, so that, as you know, of course, in his famous language, we have to we have to overcome the narrow horizon of bourgeois right, and we have to inscribe on banners of society, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Of course, another kind of biblical resonance. But I think the point of that, of course, is that socialists in the 19th century, and Proudhon is one of them, partially thought you might be able to redefine effort. You might be able to say there is such a thing as unearned money through rent, through use, through interest, through inheritance. So maybe we can sort of find a radicalization of the liberal or bourgeois language of rights and find a way to have equal distribution. And Marx, I think, really raises a serious doubt about whether you can radicalize liberal politics in that way, and that maybe what's better is, instead of thinking to reject the discourse of rights and this moral theory of desert, and just think that, in fact, we shouldn't have to fulfill our needs through the intermediary notion of labor, but we should have a collective right to a commons, a negative commons, maybe of some kind. And it should be a common, a democratic, a collective right. So again, from each according to his ability, to each according to their needs. I'm running out of time, and I definitely don't want to go over. I just want to say on the flip side. So this, I think, is also very powerful because it's Marx's deep anti-moralism, an anxiety about the moralistic language of just desert. And I'm just going to end because I think this is sort of the other side. The anarchists, of course, also had a radical critique of the division of labor, but they tended to do the opposite, which is really raising the moral language about our complicity in consumption of production. So just a quick example, so Tolstoy again wrote a famous pamphlet called The Slavery of Our Times, again, using this analogy between modern wage slavery and factory slavery and slavery and the life of the serf as well. And he, of course, thought if we participate in a decadent division of labor, we consume without laboring. The rich and the idle especially, but more and more of us live off the labor of others. And this is the problem of modern industrial labor, of degrading labor that's constantly soul destroying, monotonous labor that is constantly relegated to those below us. And of course, for him, he thinks this is a moral complicity we have to bear. We are responsible. So what can we do? We have to structurally change the system, but we have to change our habits of laboring and consumption. So this, of course, led to radical experiments in trying to get out of the division of labor, utopian experiments, self-sufficient communities, cooperative labor, ideas of bread labor, which was the idea that you had to contribute a minimal amount of manual labor. So this is especially about elites and professionals who have distanced themselves from actual laboring. So again, I think there's something interesting here where Tolstoy will say, we've thought a lot about the first two, changing taxes, about redistributing land. We think of all these progressive socialist ideas, but the third is that we still live in a world of capitalism in which we are controlled by increasing and unsatisfied needs. And we have to reform ourselves and our behavior and our desires and our way we live vis-a-vis property and products. So I think, to me, the interesting question here for our contemporary moment is, of course, I think the hyper moralization, which is also, I think, raises deep and interesting questions about consumption, about climate politics, and again, like some connection. So again, the Marxists might say, we focus on the abolition of labor. That, again, Marx was not talking just about the abolition of property, but abolition of labor as such, that we can move beyond laboring in the traditional way. And of course, for the anarchists who say that might be a fantasy, we live in a world that we may never get rid of labor. So instead, we have to either value all labor, give dignity to all labor, participate equally in manual labor, self-sufficient labor, but also that we structural reform and self-reform. It's not an either or. We have to do maybe both structural reform, but also think about what the reform of our desiring selves are in a system of capitalism, even as we might rethink what the commons might be, what laboring might be, and all of these things that we know are radically transforming in our daily lives as such. So sorry, I went over there.
No, not at all. That was brilliant, and thank you so much for putting on the table actually the connections to prison abolition and to police abolition in such a powerful way. And we hadn't created that intersection in the third seminar on the abolition of the police and defunding the police. But I think you're entirely right that disarticulating the differences in the relationship to the state is crucial to understanding today the different positions that are taken in the debate over over the police, right? And I think that's entirely right. That I think that the conflict between one position that does nevertheless maintain some strong notion of governing, right, versus the other that the more anarchist position is precisely what could be viewed as creating so many of the cleavages in those debates. We'll be coming back to prison abolition specifically in February, so we'll want to kind of hold on to that, but it ties back to the police abolition as well. So that was brilliant, and of course everything else will come back to a number of things. And as you were talking, I was remembering, I was being surprised that the only place that prison reform, to the best of my knowledge, I mean, I'll have to reread it, but the only place where I marked prison reform as coming up in the Communist Manifesto was in the critique of Proudhon, right? There's
Yeah.
reform for the benefit of the working class. This is just nothing but a bourgeois socialism in some sense. Uh, and of course, we know all the problems with issues of the lumpen proletariat, which I hope that we will get to talk about a little bit. So that was terrific.